strategies for gathering risk information from around Tesco Group, analysing that data and then pushing it out to the organisation. When we say push it out to the organisation, we mean everything from our 5,000 site managers from across the globe all the way up to our executive level reporting. I've been with Tesco for 22 years, and I don't look old enough, but I've been with Tesco for 22 years. A short stint over with RBS Group working for NatWest. Most of my career has been in risk and regulatory compliance management. The reason that's important is because I want you guys to know that I've only latterly come to the systems, insight and data world. So I don't want you thinking that I was born and bred into data with a PhD in data science. I manage a team of very clever geeks who do all the work for me. But it's important to know that my journey didn't necessarily come from data, and you can all engage with that, I believe. We're all innately data scientists. We just don't know it, and I do a separate course on that, by the way, if anyone wants to see that. I have got my chartered IT professional status, and I am a technical member of IOSH, although I've just had a reminder to pay my dues, so I better do that, otherwise I won't be a technical member of IOSH for much longer. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about why the traditional way of talking about numbers falls short in the risk world. A brief case study as to how shaping the narrative incorrectly can lead to the wrong conclusions being drawn or the wrong messages being taken from your risk data. And then we're going to talk about why visualizing risk data matters. We'll talk a little bit about why we should be using visualizations to talk about risk rather than just written language alone. We'll touch a little bit on the psychology of data, talk a little bit about how we as human beings process information, touch a little bit on about the power of colour in design as well, something that is built into us innately but we don't necessarily know that we're engaging with that all the time. Talk about the golden rules of keeping data simple, talking about choosing the right visualizations for your risk information, how we can storytell and become better storytellers in terms of data, how to build a narrative arc, and then how we can understand our audience and how we tailor our messages correctly to the audience. Just remember, I was just talking about store managers all the way up to the C-suite. They need their messages delivered in different ways. Then I'm going to touch a little bit on about how you can start on your data journey. You know, I'm sure there's bags of experience sat here right now. Some of you may be just starting to interact with your data. Some of you may not even know where to start. So we're not going to get very technical, but we're going to talk about where, with a pencil and a piece of paper, you can start analysing your risk information to draw actionable insights. And then we're going to bring it all together with a brief conclusion at the end. So let's talk about why numbers alone fall short. Safety data often dies in spreadsheets, right? Without context, numbers, they can feel very abstract, but we've got to remember that each incident or each incident record in your books is a person who has been harmed, a person who went home injured, or a person who went home safely. But there's a reason why the numbers sometimes fall short, and the first thing to know is that we don't actually remember numbers very well. We're not built as human beings to remember numbers very well, and you may have a degree in mathematics, you may have a really scientific brain, but you are sort of forcing your brain to work in a way that it isn't fundamentally geared to do. 63% of people remember a story, but only 5% of people recall a stat. I didn't make that stat up, by the way, but most stats aren't important, to be honest. Numbers don't always mean something. Numbers don't always equal meaning in the way that we think, and we'll touch on the psychology of that in a moment. And spreadsheets don't necessarily save lives, so it can be very difficult for recipients of data to engage with those numbers on a spreadsheet. Safety is not abstract. Safety is personal. You guys know that as safety professionals, but do your stakeholders who are running a business understand that? Let's talk about a case study where this information or where this narrative arc can go wrong. Climate scientists and policymakers agreed that limiting global temperatures to a rise of 2 degrees Celsius on a day like this, it's easy to tell why they've been talking about that, to pre-industrial levels was a key threshold to avoid catastrophic climate change. And this became their central benchmark for communicating out the 2-degree target, right? And we still talk about the 2-degree target now and how we're missing it. But that missed the mark with the people that they were trying to convince, us and the policymakers and the politicians. And the reason for that is because most people don't understand what 2 degrees meant. we go out into the garden, it's 2 degrees warmer today than it was yesterday, we celebrate, we go and put our shorts on. We don't make the narrative link between what they were trying to make us understand with a 2-degree risk to what that actually transformed into in our real lives. The number didn't come with a visceral, visual or emotional story. It sounded small, 2 degrees sounds small, it sounded abstract, and it failed to sort of convey the massive ecological and societal effects that was going to have on us as a species and our planet. So they've started to tweak that story now, and the narrative is different. We now hear stories about climate refugees. We hear about flooded cities, and we hear about the forests that are burning, and it's brought the numbers to life. So the IPCC shift from 2 degrees to a more story-driven framing in its 2018 re-evaluation of the climate change crisis is now far more engaging. And I think if I asked anyone in this room what the target was to avert climate change crisis, you'd probably know that it was 2 degrees, or 1.5 degrees is sometimes banded around as well. Visualizing data is really important. Why do we need to visualize data? Any data, not just risk data. Well, the first thing to say is that poor visualization often leads to poor decision making. Risk data is often complex. You guys often talk in terms of long-term scenarios. You know, when we look at risks, we measure them over 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. A lot of people don't do that. But we also engage with our specific risks on a more direct basis, right? You know, if you look at risks like financial risks, the bankers are always looking in 5, 10-year, 20-year change formats. But you guys are interacting with your safety risk every day, and your people are interacting with it every day. But those numbers can be abstract and feel difficult to interpret. Poor visualization leads to misunderstanding of data, as we've said, but that can then equal poor decision making as well. It's also worth thinking about accessibility of information. We'll talk a little bit why that's even more important in a while, but if your data isn't accessible to your stakeholders, then they're never ever going to understand it. Now, if you think about how we all know, don't we, that the workforce is changing, look at some of the HSC stats. Our workforce is getting younger. We've got the new, I can't remember what they're called Generation Z coming up through the bottom. You've got us millennials in the middle, but the workforce is also getting older at the end as well. So you've now got a very diverse workforce where you've got people who like to learn in the old ways. And I'm just seeing over here, we've got a new TikTok-style training platform for our youths. So we have to make sure that our data is accessible in a way that's easy to understand by the stakeholders. And let's talk a little bit about the psychology behind that. Our brains are wired to recognize patterns, right? And that's a primordial thing. When we were hunter-gatherers out looking for our food or trying to find our food, we weren't looking at a spreadsheet to work out where our next meal was coming from. We were recognizing patterns. And that's why when you look at a house, you see a face. When you look at the front of a car, you identify the face, because you are actually identifying the animal that you were once hunting down. And our brains are fundamentally wired to do that. So why wouldn't we present our data in the same way? We process visual data 60,000 times faster than the written word. Now, some of that is just mechanical because you actually have to read left to right or right to left, depending on the language you're reading, and that takes time, right? That takes longer than looking at an image. But our brains are fundamentally wired to receive visual data faster than written data. So, you know, when you're writing your 27-page incident reports or your recommendation or your risk assessments to your stakeholders, probably isn't quite hitting the mark, even if you think it is. It's also important to know that shapes, colours and positioning also influence the way the message is received. We'll talk again a little bit later on about how the right colours can affect the way that information is received by your stakeholders. It's something you should be really mindful of. The power of colour in design. So look, red, amber, green works very well. We know that it works very well. There's a reason why traffic lights across the world are red, amber, green. It's tried and tested. But it only works if it's used consistently. There are some countries in the world where it means the opposite. So in that country, you'd probably write your risk reports the different way around, right? Your risk matrices would probably start it red at the bottom and be green in the top right-hand corner. So just remember that when you're positing it to your audiences. Avoid random colour schemes. Now, hopefully where you work, you probably have some sort of brand design or a brand standardization that you use for conveying your messages. But if you're new to data or you're new to writing data reports, you quite often get a bit excited about the visualizations that are available, and before you know it, you've got some sort of spaghetti diagram on the page. So be consistent with your colours, and fewer colours is always better, and we will touch on that later. but also use visual cues. Did you know that about 10% of men are colourblind? And before you come at me, the reason I call out men specifically is that very few women are colourblind. Actually, some are, but the majority are men. In fact, I'm red-green colourblind, although I can see the traffic light on this slide. But there's something to think about, right? And you'll notice now when you visit websites and you hover over images, there's something called alt text now, which is a descriptor of what you're seeing. Let's talk about the golden rules of keeping it simple now. So we're going to give you some examples of some visualizations. I'd imagine you're familiar with some of these. You'll have seen them where you work. And try and show you how we can quickly improve the language whilst conveying exactly the same information. So a key principle in data visualization is to keep things simple. Clutter creates confusion. So we should use clear labels and we should avoid excessive text or complex layouts. If your audience has to decode the chart, you've lost them straight away. Yeah, they disengage from it straight away. How many of you recognize one of these stacked charts where you work? Have you seen them produced for you? Have you been a recipient of one of them? Let's look a little bit closer at it. Decimal places are all over the place. There must be, 30 different numbers in that diagram. The axes are really hard to interpret. We've got shortening of some months and we've got lengthening of other months, but we're also conveying two sets of information here. We're trying to show the total risk rating for this particular visual, but also break it down as well. It's too complicated, right? Let's look at this version instead. Isn't that better? Isn't that cleaner? It's like going to the opticians and they're saying number 1 or number 2. Say number 2 is better because I can see clearly now, as the famous song goes. You can see what we've done here is we've conveyed the exact same information, but we've used colour and simplicity to highlight the information that we need our stakeholders to understand. They don't need to understand the last 2 years' performance, they need to understand this year's performance in this example. There, of course, will be examples when they do need to understand last year's performance. Can you see as well that we've used the title heading of the diagram to convey what we want to tell them? So we're saying that the dark blue writing in the title is matching the dark blue data set in the chart, and the grey writing is matching the grey chart data. So much better and so much more easy for your users to understand. You'll all recognise one of these. I know you'll all recognise one of these. A time series graph, but a time series graph that's using awful colour palettes. It's too complicated. We've got banding along the axes. And, I couldn't really tell you what's going on there, right? We've all seen them. Again, I've been a recipient of one of those. And before I knew what I was doing, I was producing these kind of things, right? How about this one? Again, you're using the title to tell you what the information is relating to. We're highlighting this year's information, and we're using emboldening of our colour palette. We're not producing scientific graphs. We don't need to see the line series. We don't need a lot of complexity there. We don't need really specific axes on the side either. We just need really clear information, because remember, your brain is looking at the pattern and the shape. It's not reading to see where those points are on the axes. This is my favourite one. So again, we're trying to display 2 lots of information here. We're breaking down our yearly performance of this specific KPI or KRI, and we're breaking it down by quarter. Okay, that might be quite useful in the risk management spheres. But again, it's really difficult because you've got 2 sets of data. Really, you should have 2 axes on that, because you've got a time series graph overlaid on a stacked column graph there as well. This one shows the exact same data. But in a different way. Now, how much more easy is it to understand that? You can see immediately which year is performing worse than the other years, but you can see specifically where each one of those quarters is poorly performing as well. And once again, you're using the title in the chart to convey the information. You don't need a lot of written text there, because your eyes are recognising the pattern. And immediately, if I say which year is the worst, you say the last year on the chart, right? Let's talk a little bit about which visualizations you should be using when you convey risk information to your stakeholders. By the way, guys, I'm using risk data as a sort of generic term. I know we're probably thinking more about safety risk, but this could be used for any principal risk that you or your teams are managing. The first thing to say is you should never be using pie charts. There's a saying in the data world, which is you should never use a pie chart unless your CFO asks for one. Now, look, I should retract that statement slightly. There is a time and a place for a pie chart. But do you remember what we've just been saying about how we recognise patterns and we don't read the information in there? So as soon as you've got more than 1 or 2 elements that you're trying to display in a pie chart, you'll start seeing that information incorrectly. And if this pie chart had 49%, 51% on it, it would be very difficult to know which one of those slices was biggest, right? It doesn't represent proportionality very well. So my recommendation and takeaway for you is don't use a pie chart. And by the way, donut charts don't count either just because it's got a hole in the middle of them. They're still pie charts in any other sense of the word. There's very few reasons you should use one. Let's talk about measuring probability versus impact. You guys know what one of these are, right? You've all seen a risk matrix. Some may have more boxes, some may have fewer boxes. If you're in a different part of the world, the boxes might be the other way around. That doesn't matter. There's a reason why likelihood and severity or consequence and likelihood charts have always been around in risk management fundamentals since we've been looking at risk management. That's because it works, okay? I'm calling it out because I have seen some techie people try and use different ways of visualizing LNS ratings, and it just doesn't work. This doesn't work. I've even seen people try and use radar charts to convey risk data. If you're the CEO of the business and you want to know where you are, is it red? Is it amber? Or is it green? And is it very red? Is it very amber? Or is it very green? Trends over time, you should always be using a line chart or a time series chart. Again, you should be using them really very simply. You shouldn't be displaying more than 1 or 2 time periods of information, so 2 years on this. If you're starting to look at more than one period of information, then you probably want to start thinking about things like a bar chart or a column chart. If you want to compare categories, you really only need a bar chart to be doing that. Again, a bar chart or a column chart is very good for that. Good for side-by-side comparisons, and it allows you to look at the differences. And again, contrary to a pie chart, which you might be tempted to use, you can see the proportionality of them, right? You can see that number 1 is much smaller than number 2, and you can see that number 2 is much smaller than number 3. Much more difficult to do that with the way our brains are wired using a pie chart. Very underrated, but very, very useful is a waterfall chart. I don't know if you guys use them where you are, or whether you're interested in looking at like-for-like period comparisons, depending on whatever those periods are. Now look, some of you who are a bit data-y will come to me and say, Matt, that isn't traditionally a waterfall chart, because a waterfall chart is designed for really understanding the differences between periods over a time series. But with a few tweaks, you can very easily see now that for this pretend data for this year, which periods were worse than the corresponding period the year before, right? Very easy, very visual, and very quickly understood by the user. And then finally, when it comes to looking at things like risk distribution, stack bar charts really are very, very useful for that. Now let's talk a little bit about storytelling with risk data. We've been talking about the fact that raw data does lack context, and people do need a good narrative in order to connect with the risks. So when we think about those visuals that we've just been talking about, it should answer 3 things. It should answer what is the risk. The amount of charts I've seen where there's been no concept or context in terms of what that chart relates to. Does it relate to this part of the business or the whole business? Does it relate to this year or last year or what the cat had for breakfast? You really have to use your labeling very well. And I know that sounds very basic, but you'll be very surprised when you see how many charts are produced that don't tell you what the context is of them. You should be talking about why does it matter? Now, why, dear CEO, why am I telling you this information? Probably because you want some resource, or you want some funding, or you want some sort of support in terms of managing that risk. And you should be talking about what action should be taken. So you don't just say, look, here's a problem, boss. You say, this is the problem. This is why it's a problem, why it matters for us. It's going to hurt your bottom line, or we're going to get reputational damage, or we're going to get regulatory fines. And then what action should be taken? Boss, my recommendation is that you should be doing this. You haven't got to do it, but that's my recommendation. So an example of how we might do that, a bit like the example we gave with climate change, instead of just presenting fall from height risk as 85%, what does that mean? Does it mean the likelihood is 85%? Does it mean the risk of it happening in our business is 85%? Show the comparison. The risk from falling from height has increased by 50% in the past year, so putting our lift operators at higher risk than ever. Does that make sense? So immediately you're contexting the risk, you're talking about why it matters to the person you're talking to, and you're giving it a metric as well. When you build a narrative arc, again, look, I don't want to over-egg this. You'll probably do this naturally when you write your reports. But every safety presentation needs stakes, right? There has to be some stakes in there so that your stakeholders can care about it. So think about what happens if we don't act. What's the better future that we can reach? So when you set up your POSIT, as they call it, to your stakeholder, tell them what's the current risk picture. Then create a conflict. Tell them what's at stake. Don't just tell them good news. If there is good news, tell them, but create conflict in the report. And that doesn't mean your data has to disagree with what you're writing about. It means there has to be conflict between you and the stakeholder. You need to raise the ante, raise the stakes. What actions are we going to do to reduce that risk? And again, you should always be using a metric where possible to measure that risk. I'm going to move from high 4 on my 5x5 to low 2 on my 5x5. And the benefits of that will be lower regulatory risk, there'll be less fines, better reputational stakes, etc. And then call that stakeholder to action. What do they need to do? What do I need from you to enable me to do what I need to do? Now, we've talked a lot about stakeholders. We need to talk about matching your voice and matching your engagement to each part of the stakeholder. So let's talk about management. How would you engage with management? Well, the management is interested in the big picture stuff. They're interested in the sales. They're interested in bottom line profit. They're interested in turnover. So talk to them in those terms. You and I are safety people. We care about our people getting home. And I guess the CEO cares about that as well. But the CEO cares more about keeping the stakeholders, the shareholders happy. And okay, they may make some sort of mention towards the safety of our people, depending on how mature you are in terms of your safety culture journey. And I shouldn't be too facetious about it, but you should be talking to your CEO and your C-suite about the impact on their profits, the impact on productivity. How much is it going to cost you? How much is it going to hurt the bottom line? When you engage with your safety teams, you're already preaching to the choir, right? Your safety teams are the subject matter experts, so you can get a bit more technical with them. They're the people who you want to sort of get your risk reports out and sort of get stuck in, start talking about stuff, because they're excited about it. They'll be asking you questions, and it's a safe environment. When you talk to your employees, it's okay to use data. Don't dumb it down. I'm not saying you dumb it down. I'm just saying you use data in a really measured way. For example, when you're doing your toolbox talks, you want to be talking to them shoulder to shoulder, maybe sharing a few charts if it helps, if that visualization helps them, so they understand what the risks are to them and the organization and how to make it better. And finally, for this section, if we just talk about the data collection journey, and there are whole textbooks written about this. I'm not going to get too heavy in terms of data management principles. Go and find yourself some people who can help you with that if you need them to. But the data journey starts with your raw metrics. So my advice to you is, where possible, you should be using digital tools to be collecting your information. In Tesco, only 12 years ago, we were still using triplicate accident forms, written accident forms. If you had an accident, if you were lucky, the duty manager would come down tutting and rolling their eyes because they had to go and fill the baked beans to take down your details. They'd do it on a carbon copy form. They'd probably forget to put the bit of cardboard in, so it'd write through to all the different pages underneath. We would then hand one copy of that to the injured person, which drove our insurable risk team mad, because you're basically writing an admission of guilt immediately and handing it over to the person who was injured. We then sent one off to our team in Cardiff, now based in Scotland in Dundee, who would scan that into a computer, try and read the illegible data, and then put it into a database, and then we keep one in the site as well. As we've moved through to using digital tools, we've become far more mature in terms of our accident data. So don't write this stat down, please, but we were having about 80,000 accidents a year across Tesco Group. By the way, remember we serve 1 million customers a day, right? So a lot of that is our customers, knocking themselves or tripping over. About 80,000 accidents a year in 2012, and we're now seeing, this is publicly available information, of course, but we're now seeing about 33,000 accidents a year. Far too many, of course. But we only started seeing those reduction in accidents when we were able to have digitized tools that allowed us to collect our information, analyze it, and create actionable insights. Once you've got the power of data, you can then inform your stakeholders, you can get engagement from your C-suite, you can start understanding what mitigation strategies you need to be putting in to support your efforts. Data moved into insight, which is where you turn all that jumble of data into patterns and extract insights that you can then use to inform your strategies. You then turn it into a humanly framed story, which we've just been touching on, and then that then creates your action. And this virtuous cycle goes back all the time. So once you've done that, that informs your risk registers, that informs your risk assessments, which creates more data. The effectiveness of your controls gets improved. That feeds back into the start of the data silo, and then you start again. And all of this virtuous cycle of data management ideally should see you move through your safety management journeys, but also see a reduction in your injury frequency rates. How are we doing for time? Getting on, aren't we? So when you think about what metrics you should be using, you should always be using a blend of lagging and leading indicators. I hope you all understand what I mean by lagging and leading indicators. Lagging basically is what's happened, a measure of performance. Leading is what can you do to mitigate or prevent those things from happening. And people say, well, where do I start with leading and lagging indicators? Well, here's just a handful of the ones that we use in Tesco to, take a quick picture of that. That's a good one, isn't it? This is just a handful of the measures that we use for managing our performance and the effectiveness of our safety management system. You think about where should I start? Always start with what you've got. So you've already got incident reports, you've already got near-miss reports. I know you have, even if they are in the old notebooks and you're gathering them or putting them into an Excel spreadsheet. So here's a little exercise you can do to take away to have a meaningful conversation with your stakeholders. Draw yourself a little grid on a piece of paper like this with the time of day and the day of the week, and get your incident records for the last year or so. A bit arduous. Take a pen and pencil out and just map how many have happened. And look, immediately you start getting actionable insight. Immediately you can start using these kind of visuals to share with your stakeholders so they can understand where incidents are happening and where you need to do things. I bet you record where the injuries happen, right? So why don't we start looking at start mapping where the injuries are happening to our colleagues, and again, using a pen and paper, you can tally it up, and you can start correlating that with your location in the workplace. You can do a very similar exercise. Get yourself a blueprint out of your site and start putting little X's where the incidents have happened or where the near misses are being reported. You don't need software, you don't need a data management degree, but if this wets your whistle, you then might start moving into those sort of more useful tools for doing this work. I'm conscious of time, but I just do want to tell you about something that's been very, very impactful in Tesco. And that's by using correlation analytics to look at where some of your leading indicators might be intrinsically linked to your lagging indicators. Something you can do is plot your injury frequency rates against your training completion rates. And very quickly you can start to see how effective your training is. Now look, we all know as safety people that if you train people, they should have fewer accidents, right? This allows you to prove it scientifically, and this allows you to go to your board of directors or whoever's in charge and say, I need more money, I want to train my people more. And you can do this by site, you can do it by trainer. You'll probably find out that you've got some trainers that aren't very good. And what about if you've got really good high injury frequency rates, but also really good training records? Well, it may turn out that you've got some people who are just ticking boxes, so it's a good measure of your compliance culture as well in your business. So in summary, start with a question, not the numbers, because you should be asking what matters, and then look for the data. Choose the right visual for the message. Pie charts, bar charts, or simple text. Clarity is key. Yeah, you can use a pie chart if you want, but I wouldn't recommend it. Give the numbers a voice. Translate data into something that your audience can feel. Remember that we are animals and we are using our animal brains to understand data. Less is always more. If you think you've revised it down as far as you can go, try again. You can take more out. Simplify and spotlight your data. Don't drown your message in noise. Start with what you have and then work up from there. Now, I don't think we've really got time for Q&A, but you can always catch me afterwards if you'd like to. But I would like you to tell you a little bit about a course that we're developing with RRC, which is Data Skills for Health and Safety. We've identified that in the safety management space, there's a bit of a disconnect between understanding data, collecting data, and then moving that into a way where I can create really good reports and visualizations that I can share with my stakeholders. So we're facing into that challenge, and we're creating some online training resources, which yours truly is helping to write. So it's not ready yet, but we would like you to certainly have a little browse on the website and see if it's something that you might fancy in the not too distant future. Thanks very much, guys. I'll take a question. You guys, your time is precious, and I have to get back to Cornwall in a minute as well, so answered all your questions. Fantastic. Brilliant.